December 17th, 2020. This is a rebroadcast of December 16th, 2020. C-SPAN coverage of the Senate hearing on possible vote tampering. And if you're trying to get an understanding, there were some very good speakers. But Christopher Krebbs is the one that needs to be pried apart. He's being put out there like the firewall. Like he's the guy that made sure we did not have any vote tampering. And that's how he's being positioned. But it's not true. Krebbs started, he admits, he started 4 years ago trying to make sure the election was hack-proof, that there were no foreign interests influencing the vote, altering the vote. So his mind is more on the software issue. But there's a peopleware issue as well. He was not prepared for that role. His role was strictly on how can I monitor all the equipment to make sure it's operating correctly. Which is interesting because that brings up another point. Because if he's connected to all the hardware all over the country, monitoring it, then that means it was online, which means it could have been hacked. But besides that, which is a whole other issue, besides that point, we had changes just in the last year, in the last 6 months. So when he says he's been preparing for 4 years, it's not true. When you say you're preparing for something for if you're preparing for a test for 4 years, and 6 months before the test is given, they add several chapters, change the order of things, change the questions. It doesn't matter if you prepared for 4 years. If the content is changed, that claim of 4 years preparation is no longer valid. It's marginally valid, but not valid in a way you can sit there and say, we've been preparing for 4 years. No. COVID-19 changed every state's rules on how they would accept votes. So the question is, was Mr. Krebbs involved in that? Were his people being consulted with? Was each state, before they made changes to how they would send out votes and accept votes, they were virtually every state changed their policy. Okay? Was he involved in that? Did they ask him for approval? Why didn't he step in and say, look, if there's going to be changes made, they have to be uniform from state to state? Wouldn't that have made sense? Wouldn't that have been the thing to do? To make this not a Democrat or Republican issue, but a national issue? The issue of some states counting votes as they came in, while other states waited until after Election Day to start counting their votes, was ludicrous. That right there is a huge violation of what he was supposed to do, if that was his job. See, I feel what happened was they set up this whole committee to focus on hacking and preventing hacking and all this stuff, and they never did the other side, which is on the ground level. Now, maybe that's what the FBI was there to do. I don't know. Maybe that's the secrecy of it. But it seems like if the FBI and everyone had been involved, one of the rules they would have come up with would have been, look, all the rules have to be the same for all the states. If COVID-19 is going to cause some states to change the rules on ballots, absentee ballot policies, and all this stuff, it's got to be uniform from state to state. And further review would have made people realize if votes are coming in for several weeks and they're not being counted, that could pose logistical issues. Because once you start setting up safe rooms where you're storing these ballots, I mean, who has access to those rooms? Couldn't they be bringing in ballots every night? An extra few bundles and mixing them in with the other ballots? Whereas if you're counting them every night, it just seems like it's a more streamlined system, and it's going to be harder there's going to be more focus because the ballots are being counted at the same time. Whereas when they're just stored for weeks somewhere and not counted, that just seems... And those are the states that had the problems. We had the protests during the summer. That was very politically divisive. It was a gambit the Democrats played to try to blame police brutality on Republicans. That's what they did. So was he oblivious to that? Was he oblivious to vote registration that was set up after the protests? Now, for first-time voters, is it right to register people first time, and while you're actually registering them, you're literally basically telling them to vote Democrat by the way the facility is constructed to register the voter? If there's memorabilia in the room, if people are freely talking about who they're going to vote for while a first-time voter is registering, is that really something that they should they not have been involved in that? Do you see how undermanned they really were? So he's come forward to say we had the most secure election, but it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean enough. Secure in what way? That they figured out how to monitor all the machines so that nobody else could get in there, and yet they're showing, he's admitted to already that there were auditing errors. He knows he will occasionally spill the beans and then he moves on really quickly. There is something going on here that I hope, it's a kind of a shame because I guess the hearings are based on who once the Senate loses Republican majority, if that happens, then there won't be any more hearings. This will all be buried. So, wow, how big is Georgia? And guess what? In Georgia, they're doing the same type of voting they did that is being already under investigation. They're going to do the same thing again. So, this is all really a big deal. And I hope that Mr. Krebbs is actually grilled in private by the Trump's lawyers, and that he starts naming the names of his field generals so that they can be interviewed, so they can start admitting to the problems they encountered. Because this whole idea that there were no problems is based on a very tunnel-visioned view of what they consider a secure election to be. Like I said, all the changes that went on in the last 6 months prove that the planning from 4 years ago is irrelevant. It's irrelevant what they did 4 years ago if each state is changing the rules on how they're going to accept votes. This is he's opening up a huge can of worms, but because it's in the middle of big hearings, I don't even know if it's going to get caught. Anyway, I'm going to play what he said.
Thank you. And my last question. Early in this election cycle, CISA and the FBI highlighted the potential threat that foreign elements could pose to the U.S. election system through disinformation campaigns. Looking back, did the U.S. do enough to prepare for this threat from both foreign and domestic actors?
Ma'am, we had the distinct advantage this time around of having about 3.5 to 4 years to prepare for this election. And that's in comparison to the prior administration. They only had about 4 months. We had 4 years. I know my team, we took every moment of the day to think through any number of scenarios. I've talked about it often that I was paranoid, that we were looking for every angle that we possibly could. And I think that ultimately benefited us from a preparation perspective when it came around, and that we had a full range of scenarios we'd work through, that we'd improve security at the state level. But ultimately it came down to those perception hacks. It came down to disinformation. And I think rumor control was an incredibly valuable tool that we need to think about from a government-wide perspective. How rumor control, I've said rumor control as a service. How can we use rumor control to help ensure counter disinformation on the vaccine for COVID as it rolls out? Those are the sorts of things we need to be thinking about.
It's just like, he's not encompassing the reality of what went on. for him to sit there and say he had 4 years to plan, and yet every state legislature was doing what they wanted in terms of their decisions on their ballots just months before the election. Did they run that by him? No. They just did what they were going to do, and he kind of tagged along. You know, if anything, he probably just told everybody, as long as the ballots can be counted by the ballot machines, you're fine. Think about that. That's not... There is something he did that was radically wrong, and he knows it. And he's trying to point out all the things he did right to take attention away from some miscalculation he made, in that either he didn't have enough people, because it just, like I said, every state seemed to do what they wanted to do. Absentee ballot votes, they removed all the rules in 2020. You're supposed to have a doctor's letter, or you're supposed to a written statement that you're requesting. They waived it. All you had to do is request a ballot. That's in the states that didn't just mail them out. He never will address the issue that there were a record amount of mail-in ballots sent out, and exactly what all the protocols were that would prevent any kind of double vote, buying somebody's vote. Can a blank vote be counted? You know, just simple things. Like the ballots are supposed to have something printed on them so that they're unique, one per person. And frankly, if you're going to send a ballot because a person moved a couple of times, so you send a ballot to each address, then there should have been a little 1, 2, or 3 to designate how many different addresses you sent. So that way when they vote, that would be circled. 1, 2, or 3. Like, you know, like, so for instance, address 1 would have the 1, it'd be a little bit bigger. You have a code, a barcode, and then a 1. But then because you know you had to send it to another address they were at, that would have a 2, and the 2 would be bigger. And then another one, and the 3 would be bigger. So you know you sent 3 ballots to the same person, and then whichever one comes back in, you know that was the valid address. But now, if another ballot comes in with the 1 or the 2 from that same person, also large, you know that a second address mailed one in. So there's just, I want to know all this stuff. I don't see why we have to keep rushing forward into the next thing. I want to know it all now. I don't even mean this minute. I mean like in the next year. I don't want this to go away. If there's a reason to vote to make sure the Republicans have a majority in Georgia, it would be just to make sure, although that's probably not going to happen because they're going to do the same thing again. But vote anyway. But if you're Republican, vote anyway. But definitely vote by mail, and then definitely vote the day of, and just tell them, I voted by mail, but I didn't get my result yet, so I want to vote provisionally. And then that way, if they count it twice, they count it twice. If they don't, that's fine too. But you're being totally honest and legal. That's what I think the Democrat scam was, or scheme, that they pulled off, was with the provisional ballots. So you vote, let's say you vote a week before, but then because they don't count the votes before Election Day, you go online and, oh, they didn't count my vote. So you go in person, you tell them, look, I voted online, but my vote never showed up. So they give you a provisional ballot, right? Well, the scam is that provisional ballot's just supposed to be put aside and not open, touched, or anything until all the votes are counted. Then the provisional ballots are taken out and they cross-reference them to see if that person's other vote came in or not. But they didn't do that in several of these states. They converted those provisional ballots into untraceable valid ballots. That was the election scam. And it was done, apparently it was done in a highly densely pro-Joe Biden cities. So maybe Joe Biden won the city by 75% to 25%, but because of the provisional ballot aspect, maybe he ended up winning by 85 to 15% or 90 to 10%. And because they're cities, and they're densely populated, where they have hundreds of thousands of voters, suddenly that's a 30 or 40 or 50,000 vote swing. That's